Christian apologetics is simply the determination to defend ancient truths at all costs. And so you will bring forward...
But atheism is not that.
You will bring forward any and every
Humanism is nothing
use
like
you
that,
can
is
to
it?
defend an indefensible position.
Greetings, everyone. I'm making this video to discuss some problems I see in the methodology of Christian apologists. Now, apologists chafe when rationalists say that they use circular reasoning, and the apologist will counter this by saying that, well, the Bible is reliable because it has multiple sources, it has different authors. But this overlooks the fact that this makes their argument heavily dependent on oral tradition. The truth is, we don't know for sure who wrote the Gospels, and we have to accept the words of people who wrote about it a couple centuries later. And those people were not eyewitnesses, but people who supposedly knew about eyewitnesses. Oral tradition may be used, but it has to be established beforehand. It is reliable generally, but you have to provide evidence of its existence in the context you want to use it in so that you can establish that reliability. It is completely disingenuous to use it as a lifesaver argument to be brought up when there's no way out and you're not willing to concede a point. You have to provide evidence of its existence in the context you want to use it in order to establish that reliability. For example, Luke wrote an orderly narrative of what happened, as he claims in his gospel. He researched witnesses. And according to this standard, oral tradition does not contain anything of importance that is not incorporated in Luke's gospel. So to play that card in order to explain away some problems is disingenuous, to say the least. Apologists also state that if in the legal system we allow people to defend themselves, why not allow the Bible to speak for itself? This is a fair point. However, how does the law consider a person, or in this case persons, that give conflicting testimony which cannot be reconciled? What if this happens if the testimony given is self-refuting or contradictory? Well, in court, what would happen is that the witnesses would be impeached, their evidence thrown out, and they'd be charged with perjury. Now, apologists seek to rationalize a lot of the passages which quote-unquote seem contradictory, and to list them would take forever. But the problem is that in order to reconcile these passages, we have to assume that we can't interpret these passages ourselves with human reason, but depend on theology to tell us what they really mean. Not to mention the fact that since God gave us the scriptures, you'd expect that there wouldn't be seeming contradictions regarding similar events or important doctrines. Second, the theologist tries to set up a different standard for evaluation to prove his points. He says that reason and logic have their own standards, and scriptural revelations has its own standards. And this is incredibly clever, and I have to say I'm impressed. But what the apologists seek to do here is to set up rules for evaluation which only apply to them and prevent that methodology used in almost all evaluations from applying to itself. Most people would reject this outright. But let's assume that this is true. Let's assume that the Bible does have its own standard, and let's judge it by its own standard. What is it? When you read the epistles, the Gospels, you see repeatedly how the writer tries to convince the reader that Jesus is God, he's the Messiah, and then he goes on to tell them how to convert and how to live as Christians. They point to fulfilled prophecies, to miracles, to teachings as a way of proving to the readers that their message is true. These narratives themselves use reason and logic to try and convince their readers. That is, they use reason and logic until it becomes inconvenient, because any request for further proof of these claims has to be taken on faith, because there's the absence of any tangible evidence to further prove them. When you point this out, the apologist says that if the Bible is guilty of circular reasoning, then every method is guilty of circular reasoning. Not only does this show an incredible misunderstanding of how we analyze all claims, but it reveals something more about the apologist. Namely, that they cannot ever consider evidence objectively. They have to rationalize and find a way to make everything fit, or else everything falls apart. An honest intellectual debate is where each side presents its claims, and once a resolution is reached, the losing side of an argument revises its position in order to adapt to what's actually true. The Christian apologists are not willing to do that because if they ever concede a point, they lose the whole war. What is troubling is that they're unwilling to budge from their positions when it's obvious to neutral observers that their ideological aims are untenable through the use of reason. My argument is not with the apologist, but with the neutral person in the middle, the faithful Christian who is unafraid to ask questions and understands that faith and doubt are double-edged swords, which have to test our preconceived ideas so that we can determine what is true and what is false. Are you satisfied with the apologist approach? If you are, you will end up with the same logic that the Way of the Master videos show. If you tell a lie, this makes you a liar for all time. I also recently watched a debate between Shabir Ali and Mike Licona on the crucifixion of Jesus, and it's interesting to see how Licona steps away from the biblical accounts and he seems to implicitly acknowledge that they're unreliable and uses implied evidence to support his presuppositions. And this is problematic because then we enter a guessing game. And it's problematic because he's not using the account as history. In fact, he uses redaction criticism like a lot of apologists do in the same way that the scholars of the Jesus Seminar use it, just not as often and only to support their own conclusions. Lastly, apologists will resort to special pleading to save their supernatural claims while rejecting special pleading for such claims from other faiths. Why is this? Is special pleading reserved only for Christian apologists? Perhaps, I don't know. Now, why am I against this approach? Because this means we can never have an honest debate where the conclusions we reach are not reached beforehand. And I think that's a shame. Lastly, I do think I have to correct myself. Some Christian apologetics do make sense. The only ones that make logical sense are when we see the God in the Bible through the Reformed tradition, that of double predestination, namely predestination for salvation and reprobation for damnation. And this means that you really don't have a free will. God is sovereign, and if you weren't picked to be a believer, get ready for the torture of hell. There's no use in using reason to understand it because it's the grace of God and this is a mystery. If we see God in the Bible through the lens of Wesley and free will Arminianist school of thought, apologetics do not adequately hold up to scrutiny for the above-mentioned reasons. Then again, maybe I'm wrong, and I'm making these judgments based upon my own presuppositions of using logic and reason as opposed to Christian apologetics.